This is Invisible Inc., the podcast for under-resourced women entrepreneurs. And I'm your host, Shubha Chakravarti, founder of Achieve. Join me as I talk to women entrepreneurs about the nuts and bolts of their journeys and to experts who will give you insights that are hard to find anywhere else. Let's jump in. How do you go from being an insurance actuary to a speech therapist to a health tech startup as a non-technical founder? How do you recognize the right time and place to bring your idea to the world? How do you then walk the tightrope between what inspires and drives you and what the market is telling you about the opportunity? In this episode, founder and CEO of SMARTCharts, Corinne Vargas, talks about what prompted her to change careers from numbers to words to ideas, how her unique background and experiences led to her startup idea, how she stays motivated and true to mission while still being pragmatic, and much more. Now, here's Corinne. Good afternoon, Corinne. Welcome to Invisible Inc. We're just very excited to have you here today.
Hi there. How are you?
Great. You've had a pretty interesting background. I was looking up your profile. You started off in actuarial science and then moved to speech pathology. Walk us through your journey and how you ended up being an entrepreneur.
I was an actuary for about, 8 years. I started out my career really interested in the financial aspects and business sides of just kind of the entire workforce. And after a couple of years of doing that, I had the privilege of opening an office in India with my former employer, Deloitte, and realized that I was really not only interested in working on inter and multicultural communications, but also those smaller components that actually come with the actual speaking and interacting and how we actually perceive different types of information. My thought process was to go back to school and kind of learn. I knew I was doing it well socially and wanted to figure out the science behind it. So essentially, went back to school, became a speech language pathologist, and really had the intention of starting my own business as an executive coach. That's where the entrepreneur journey started.
Couple of things there. First of all, you were actually doing actuarial work. What kind of line of work were you in? Was it my old line? So I'm interested.
Absolutely. So as an actuary, I was actually on the consulting side. So I worked for Deloitte for up to 8 years. I was also an intern there, and I was on the property and casualty side. So I always like to describe it as buildings falling or people kind of slipping and falling maybe within different commercial large retailers, as well as things like tornadoes and vehicles falling. So I was doing a ton of different types of work and financial modeling as well as claims modeling.
And then this interaction with folks while you were setting up this offshore center in India, what parts of those interactions fascinated you the most?
I mean, there was just so much there. There was a lot in terms of, I was just excited to learn a new culture and kind of to learn different ways of doing and practicing business around the world. I appreciated just getting to learn different perspectives and then how that actually worked with our operations in the United States. And I realized that there was so much talent across the world, but sometimes what's actually holding us back from reaching our ultimate potential happens to be smaller things like differences in accent or differences in the way that we communicate needs or even abilities. And so that was a precipice for, I really want to figure this out. And I think I can go back and do that.
You moved from that, you got another degree, and then you wanted to start a coaching business. What made you take that leap from being an executive coach, which is like a personal services type business, to something that's much more scalable?
The goal was to be an executive coach in international communications, as well as just individual kind of presentation and overall communications at different types of C-suite levels. And throughout that journey, in terms of going back to become a speech language pathologist, I wanted to get my speech degree and license. And when I was in grad school, I was seeing patients of all different types of backgrounds. So although I wanted to be focused on accent modification as well as very technical careers and technical talent, I had the opportunity to work with little kids with autism all the way to seniors post-stroke. And I realized that there was a commonality in terms of the way that the information was taken. We were required to write goals in a specific way. And as such, the notes that come out of those goals should have been written a certain way as well. And, I can't even remember how long it was into the program. I just realized how tedious that process was, cumbersome and just repetitive. So I, with my Excel background from the actuarial days, decided to create a macro or just more or less kind of a sophisticated spreadsheet to help me automate my notes and automate the way that I wrote goals. And so by automating the right way that I wrote goals, the notes would be generated very specifically and very quickly post session. And then I was able to turn those same notes into pictures, which then helped my patients. And I realized because speech was a soft skill that it was really hard to recognize the progress that patients were making. So it was kind of a win-win-win. It saved me time. It made sure that I was checking all of the boxes in terms of the requirements for what would be good quality documentation. And then finally, and to me, most importantly, it really allowed me to get buy-in from my patients, like I said, of all ages and all diagnoses. You could really see a difference in their performance.
And what was that one moment when this is plugging along, you're seeing what is the moment that triggered it and said, geez, this could become something bigger?
Well, there's one exact moment that sticks out to my mind as you ask me that question. I had an 11-year-old who had habituated R, so a very different sounding R. You might think of this as it's just the inability to fully make that sound. And there's different characters on TVs and such that have this difference. Everyone kind of notices, but can't really understand what it is. He was never in speech before and was really interested in remediating this speech disorder and difference at this age because he was entering a new phase of his life, a new level of social interaction and just new expectations when it came to school and stuff. So it became somewhat of a nuisance for him and a little bit embarrassing. And the thing about the letter R is that it happens in over 13 contexts in the US language. So as you think about that, that's 13 different ways that a patient has to figure out how to say the specific letter. And that's pretty daunting. So I tried to figure out how can I motivate him to actually see the progress and know that, yeah, 13 feels like a lot. And there's a lot of different levels to really knock out what we would call each block. So each large goal. I just asked him what his favorite color was, and it was green. And I started creating basically bar graphs that would get darker and taller. And as we were able to what we call topple them or tackle them, they would fall off. So that huge landscape, first we brought it into a small purview and then knocked off each individual goal. You could just see that he was getting more and more excited, but also that he was really engaged. And what I mean by really engaged is like he knew what he was working on and why he was working on it in that moment, but also after the session. And my supervisor at the time, she'd been with Northwestern for quite some time and had seen a lot of different patients throughout her entire career, but noticed his excitement and kind of some of his change, as well as the acceleration of the change. So I was lucky enough to stay with him for 3 quarters. And that's a pretty quick time to remediate an R difference when a child's over 10 years old. So it was just this culmination of like, turning progress into pictures helps every single one of us understand what we're doing, but also motivates us, right? And the more that I got removed from that situation, and then the more that some of my peers and other students in my class were asking me to use this spreadsheet, I realized maybe this is something, but quite frankly, looking back on it, I know that that was one of those big aha moments, as well as a couple others with patients. But at the time, I had just thought, this is something we should be doing. And if I can make it work for now, then I will.
Excellent. So we'll take a pause and say, what does my smart chart do or smart charts do?
At its very core, SMARTCharts helps clinicians automate their notes and turn those notes into patient-friendly pictures, graphs, and charts. We're serving speech, occupational, and physical therapists in outpatient settings. That's where we're starting at the moment. That's actually where that little kiddo and all of my patients were when I was on the Northwestern campus.
Excellent. It's right down the street from me, actually. So close to my heart. So then you're going on, you can see that something is happening. There's potential here. And then walk me through like what happens and what's the moment at which you decide I'm actually going to dive into this.
So that moment didn't happen for at least 7 years later.
7 years?
Yes, I was in grad school in 2014 and 2012, and I really didn't think seriously about doing anything with that spreadsheet, which we call internally now kind of the golden spreadsheet, until the end of 2018. And the precipice for that was I was at a speech and hearing conference actually here in Illinois, and there was another individual that was looking over my shoulder. And she essentially was looking at one of my reports for one of my executive coaching clients. And she was asking me, what is that? And over my shoulder, it essentially looked like a lot of dots on a larger graph, with up and to the right being the goal here. But she could see that all these things were moving as I was just typing in numbers. And I told her that that was my speech report. That was how I was reporting progress to my client. And she's like, that's pretty cool. We got to talking. And the more that we got to talking, I learned she had a small practice, and she asked me, do you think that we could potentially test this or use this? And so from my perspective, I just never thought about bringing this to a commercial level until that moment. And it was just one of those kind of serendipitous things that made me start thinking, okay, how do I do this, or how would I do this?
And then how did you figure that out? I mean, there's clearly a big product element, there's technology. How did you put all of those pieces in place? And how did you come to a point where you could test a product with somebody?
I definitely didn't think about any of that. So the product part, the roadmap part, the core customer, none of that. I really thought about it from the fact of like, hey, when I was in grad school and now, like, what would I do without this tool? And essentially it was like, I just felt like there was a lot of time that I was putting into information that wasn't usable to my patient. And in my real life, in my executive coaching life at that point, that it was usable to every client I had, simply because it was super streamlined and really easy to talk about, as well as like undeniably real information to the patient that could show them they were making progress, even if they didn't feel like it. So, the journey just really started out with talking to a bunch of different development firms around the United States, as well as here in Chicago, and trying to figure out who was going to be the best partner for me, not only to help me create this product, but also kind of support me in a way that I didn't know what I didn't know. I'm a non-technical founder. And so what are those things? What was a product roadmap? Where did this need to go? How do you mock up different components? And that's how the journey began. So I picked one group and kind of just went with it after a couple different meetings.
And did you have any entrepreneurial support? Did you belong to any group? Did you have the advice of other entrepreneurs? Like, how do you go from being an executive coach to figuring out even what questions to ask or who to talk to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from the business side, I'd been running my own books and creating my own financial plans and sort of those things, but it's a very different model on the executive coaching and consulting side than it would be for, a SaaS program. And I did a lot of research for the executive coaching side and made some good contacts. So I just really called upon a number of different mentors in different spaces to ask them really high level general questions. I don't really know that I solidified this as an actual product when I was talking to the majority of them. But those who got it. And then those who didn't really, really didn't. So there was a lot of learning in terms of how do I even describe what this is? And I can tell you that I am that much closer today to describing what this is. But I'm continuing to learn from our customers, as well as my mentors, as well as just peers, on how best to describe a new product that hasn't necessarily existed in this space before.
So where are you in the product lifecycle? Are you at launch, post-launch? Like, where would you describe where SmartChart is today?
Yeah, SmartCharts is actually available for individual use for individual clinicians right now. It's out at mysmartcharts.com that anyone can sign up for it. And we are right now actually providing it to them for kind of a freebie model, just individuals who need it to serve their clients, their patients, and their students. But we are serving at the moment small and medium-sized businesses, and we're working on our beta and alpha launches into the enterprise levels. It's a really exciting year coming off of last year. We're just really coming off of a lot of fun and interesting experiences that are helping us get the word out there. And it's just so imperative to actually get this to those larger levels so that we can help that many more people, both from a patient side, but also a clinician side, but in the long run, for all of us to understand the progress that we're making post-diagnosis.
So you're not in full commercial launch yet. So to go back, you've talked to your development firms, you figured out a good firm to work with. What happens then? Like, how would you describe your startup roadmap? And then how did you figure out the successive milestones and what you needed to do and how much resources you needed to make all of that happen?
Okay, so this is a great question. So I had picked the development firm in late 2018, and I didn't have a functional product until late 2019. In terms of that process, it took a really long time. So I like to think of my career as there was the actuarial side, and then there was the speech language pathologist coaching side, and then now there's this tech side. So I feel like I had to learn a new language in every single one of those facets, and it definitely took some time to get on the same page and be able to communicate what I was looking for in the actual product itself. So it was pretty cool that in late 2019, we were able to launch at a national conference for speech and language and hearing, which is the ASHA conference. And at that conference, all I did was I simply got a booth and had a bunch of iPads stands out and was just testing to see what people would think it was. And there was just a lot of interest. And there was a couple different people actually trying to pay me on the spot. And it was like, okay, now I have something, right? I was like, okay, so this is validating. And that was pretty cool because it did take a really long time to get there. And what had existed in Excel was obviously not the prettiest version, and we needed to make it super user friendly. So 2020 comes about. I had opportunities with a couple of different school districts here in the Chicagoland area, as well as some testing in some higher ed levels as well. And then we all know what happened in 2020. So that was cool because I thought education and healthcare, that's recession proof. Boy, was I wrong. So 2020, with all of our case studies that we're running and testing and efficacy and outcome and all of the plans that we had were basically put on hold. And at that moment, I had to really kind of adapt and think through how will I continue to move this forward. So that's essentially when I went to just the general market and said, hey, in the private Facebook groups, I said, is there anybody that would be interested as a therapist in automating their notes and turning those into pictures that their patients can understand? And that was the simple line. And then we had over 450 signups in under 48 hours from that posting alone. So in my mind, that was more validation to keep moving forward with this. Luckily, at that time, I was still coaching, and I continued to do coaching for the most part, actually through the middle of last year. So I was continuing to keep the livelihood up and keep the lights on while pushing the product forward. So from 2020 till actually like mid last year, there wasn't a huge propensity for hospital systems or hospital organizations to really pick up new health technologies. And the education systems were really just getting back on their feet as well. So I took that time to do a lot of product testing and development based on those users and continuing to adapt the product for those small and medium-sized businesses, learn from them. So in terms of the product and where it sits now, a little bit more succinctly, is we do have a good fully baked functional product for small and medium-sized practices that are in speech, occupational, and physical therapy. They're just not integrated into their electronic medical records. The version that we're working on is the enterprise level, which is launching this year, which will be integrated into those larger electronic medical records. So it's exciting because we're finally hitting that stride. And I think we're at a space in the world now where health technologies and med technologies are getting a little bit more of an ear than they were in the times that we were just kind of coming out of.
Pun not intended, but that's good.
I didn't even, put those two things together.
You did mention that you were going through with your day job, so to speak. I'm sure that provided some financial cushion. Was that enough? And if not, how did you think about and approach the whole funding question? Because you're still not at a fully commercializable scale yet, and development costs money.
Absolutely. So even to get off the ground, after that independent company and that woman came to me at that speech and hearing conference in Illinois, I went to my family and was like, hey, I think I want to give this a shot. And it's like ingrained in my mind because I was so afraid to talk to them about this. And it was somewhat of like not a significant amount of money, but enough to just help me with what I had saved or put together. And they were all supportive. And there was a lot of different reasons behind this, but that little bit of friends and family money that we had pulled and founder money got me through those first couple years. I was really diligent about how I was creating contracts and really thinking through kind of those financial aspects. But as I continued to move through the process, I realized that building technology is expensive and also that wasn't going to be enough. So I was working through funding last year in terms of angels and investors, and this year we'll be going for seed funding for our first larger round. Substantial funding to move us forward.
And you also won a pitch competition. I saw Alex's post today for $100,000. You want to tell us about it a bit? That's awesome.
Absolutely. Yes. It's so crazy because we're only in the second day of this year. Last year was a very exciting year. We were able to participate in a number of different competitions, and the most recent one that you're referring to is actually TechRise Chicago. And that is a really awesome organization held by EP30 here in Illinois, which is meant to support BIPOC and women founders at the earliest stages from idea to early stage product, get the funding they need to get the opportunity to get their solutions out there. And this was a culmination of actually the entire year of competitions. They provide non-dilutive grant funding all year long in weekly competitions, so check that out. But also secondarily, at the end of the year, it's a culmination of a lot of those ideas coming together in terms of a people's choice kind of competition. And so from there, you get to that stage by getting voted to a popular vote kind of thing in the top 12, and then an independent VC vote. So it was a really exciting, it was held on December 1st. It was a really exciting day. I was actually quite sick coming into it. And so it was a little bit nerve-wracking for me, but I got to get up there and tell my story. And as we're talking, I described at the very beginning of never really having the story super clean or as relatable. And I worked extremely hard throughout that process. But also, we were lucky enough to get into Techstars last year as well. And through that process that we finished in December as well, to really, I think, come to this stage despite being sick with a full story and kind of the real impact of what I was looking to do with SMARTCharts. So it was a really cool moment and a culmination of diverse founders, but also the idea that I could tell the story in a way that I had not been able to tell it before. So it was exciting to say the least, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
And congratulations. That's a very worthy victory. So that brings up, you mentioned friends and family, then you mentioned angels, you mentioned accelerators, and you mentioned pitch competitions.
Mhm.
Those are big strategic choices you need to make. And certainly in the case of pitch competitions, there's a trade-off in terms of time and effort and how much you disclose and all of that stuff. How did you think at a high level strategically about, okay, am I even going to do pitch competitions? Am I going to do accelerators? Like, how do you make that decision? What are the learnings from that process?
I don't think there was ever a question whether I would do pitch competitions and or accelerators. I think once I started really getting deep into the startup world, which I would say was mid 2020, and started really learning about what it takes to have a good pitch, what that actually means, what are all those components that you need to convey in whatever it is, 3, 5, 7, 10 minutes, and figure that out, that I knew I needed resources and I knew I needed help because as we had talked about, it was never a space that, I was really involved with previously. So I had actually done the Health Equity and Innovation Accelerator at Matter Chicago. They were paired with the YWCA, and that was a really good first step. It's really great to go back and look at that pitch and that information because, like I said, it had come so far in just a year. But that opportunity really opened the door in terms of, hey, there's a lot that I need to learn and there's a lot that I need to shore up. So from that point on, it was where can I get funding? Where can I get the word out? And what can I learn from every experience that I'm taking to that next experience to get the solution out there? I think with solutions that kind of sit in these spaces that may not be completely explicit or really easily, like a physical product, sometimes I think getting the idea out there and iterating on that idea with a diverse kind of set of perspectives, whether it's accelerators, pitch competitions, and or those that are around you, is just really important in those early days because there's no better way to say it than you just don't know what you don't know. And also you do know your product and what you're looking to do so much better than everyone else that sometimes you can get so far in the weeds you're concentrating on the wrong things in terms of what you're conveying to specific audiences. So I mean, for me, that was a big game changer for me, and it was also a lot of learning, a lot of painful learning, which I think was necessary to get to that end stage in December. So
I'll come back to that in a minute, but before that, I want to ask one thing about team. Everybody talks about how important it is to have a team. Now, clearly, you're working on this, I assume, full time. You have your dev team. Who else did you need, and how did you staff up to those capabilities that you needed, but you personally didn't think you could bring to the table?
yeah, so definitely development was the first step that I needed, and continuing to work through what are those needs, and those needs continue to evolve over time. There's been a whole host of, I would call my team a really big extension of my network and my personal support system as well. I'm a solo founder, like I said, on the non-tech side with a technical solution. So it's a very interesting space to be in. And I think being able to learn as much as I can about what I don't know really relies on that larger network, whether it's about when are you hiring this talent and where do they need to come from, and then deciphering what those first big hires are and or consultants continue to be. So the team has continued to evolve over time, and it's just such an interesting process because I feel like finding those first right strategic hires is extremely important, but also really, really difficult. So it's just
What do you do? Tell us the secret.
there is no secret other than actually, there was a mentor very recently that I went through Techstars with who said, you're going to make mistakes in hires and different types of talents. And that's just normal. You're going to make mistakes in every single part of your business. So being able to accept those mistakes and actually make quick decisions is really important. But on that flip side, being able to retain the talent that you know is going to be a game changer for you and or attract that talent is really important too. So the idea of being very explicit and clear on what expectations are, but also sticking to what that means. So whether that means expectations weren't met and it's time to separate, or we're killing expectations and we need to continue moving forward. How do I get you to stay?
And were there sources of talent that work better for you as a founder that you think other founders should be looking at?
The definite number one source of talent would be networking, in terms of using your network to find who those people are that would fit in the right roles. So, as part of executive coaching, I worked with a lot of individuals in terms of getting to their next levels or the next stages within their careers. And one of the secrets is you actually get most of your opportunities through your secondary and tertiary circles. It's the same exact way with finding talent, I have found on the flip side. So that's the number one way that's worked and helped me. The other piece that I haven't utilized quite as much, but my network and my crew all know I will be utilizing in 2023, is the team around me in terms of having them help me interview people. So finding finding those questions and asking those questions that I may not foresee or that they have a different perspective on, and for the people that really know who I am as a founder, but also the mission of SMARTCharts.
Also, on the question of funding, I think you mentioned angels and other outside investors. You're a non-technical founder. Technical expertise is at the core of your startup. So one of the things that is actually been flagged as a potential risk when an investor looks at a startup and says it's a core technical product, but the technical expertise resides outside the firm, right? How have you been able to handle that, and how do you think about managing that risk, given that all the development resides outside of your firm?
Well, actually, we have an internal developers now. Initially, yeah, there was a lot of talk of I need a technical co-founder. And there, if I'm going to be honest, there is a lot of conversation around that even currently. My answer to that is I've made it this far. I know exactly what I want to do with this product. And if the right technical co-founder were to come about, I'm not opposed to taking that person on. I actually am very open to that when it comes from VCs, but you find me that person and hey, I will give them an opportunity. However, it's a big role. And so it has to be a personal and cultural and technical fit in terms of that component going forward. That I haven't found that right individual yet. And until I do, I've got the roadmap and the talent to support in terms of all of those use cases and needs. So chief product officers, those, all of these fractional and or consulting groups, two of which have been there since the very, very beginning of SMARTCharts. So it's not a concern for me at this moment. And there's contingency plans and continued hiring to make sure that we're filling those needs as we go forward. But that's my answer is if you find me the right person, then hey, I'm open to it. But at this point, it's just not, it hasn't happened quite yet.
I'll keep my ears open for you for sure. So thanks for answering that. So next, coming to the business model, right? That's like the critical heart of any startup. How did you think about the business model, particularly your revenue model, your go-to-market strategy, and your pricing? And you can take those one by one.
So the business model is highly informed by the financial model, and the financial model is highly informed by that price. It's all interrelated. And so there's been so much to learn in terms of who's actually using our product, figuring out why they're actually using our product. And is it the intended use of what I actually created? Is it in line or is it a little bit different? So it's really leaning into what is working and what are we delivering as a value proposition. So for us, that means time. And what does time mean? That actually quite literally means money in a lot of different situations. So in our space, that means time that clinicians or therapists are documenting notes. If you, for example, are in physical therapy, you might see your physical therapist typing away frantically at the end of your session or maybe throughout your session. We're trying to remove that entire process. So saving time on the documentation in and of itself. There's a whole communication process that comes along with any sort of therapeutic interventions or rehabilitation. What does that mean? Your physical therapist is telling you how you're doing, right? Or your speech therapist is telling you how your child is doing as they're getting better throughout the process. That's a lot to disseminate without kind of a reference. So we are deciphering how much time we're saving in communications with the care team, so that would include other clinicians, the doctor, etc., the family, so that includes caregivers and parents, the patient themselves, and then also just being able to pick up a new patient and kind of run with them. And then finally, there's the component of data interoperability. We all know that there's a huge issue on the healthcare side, and the continuum of care is definitely disrupted by the idea that you really can't read other institutions' notes very quickly or notes in general. So we're really tackling those problems. And so from a time and profitability side, that is where our pricing comes from, is how much does it cost to pay a clinician? How much are we expecting out of our clinicians given limited time? How much time can we get them back? And then how much more can we get reimbursed? So that's where the pricing model really has come from. In terms of when we think back to how are we actually charging, or what kind of business model did we go with? Like I said, we were testing in higher education and small and medium sized clinics. And the more research I did, the healthcare industry is much more condensed in terms of the tools that they're using at the enterprise level. I do believe that this solution needs to be a top-down solution for that data interoperability component, but also because at those smaller state or the smaller levels of kind of care, there's a ton of different options, just like there is in education. And for us to adapt and actually really make a difference in terms of creating data sets and databases that will do predictive modeling and machine learning for all of us to help us get better faster, we need to enter at a space that makes sense, not only from a business standpoint in terms of pricing, but also an impact. So what does that mean, getting enough data?
So it sounds like the enterprise model is you almost have to do it, right? It's inevitable for you to be able to expand into these markets, achieve that kind of scale, and get the kind of data you need to, to keep continuing to improve the product and its impact. Is that a fair characterization?
Yep, absolutely. Is it absolutely necessary? No. But as I worked through making those decisions, the idea of getting the product as defined and as, how do I describe this? Defined and as applicable to as many people as possible quickly. Those are the levels that we need to tackle, which is those larger spaces that the electronic medical records live in. And that's great. Electronic medical records, by the way, are not going anywhere, but we're there to supplement and help those electronic medical records work that much more smoothly in cases that they necessarily were not exactly built for. So like I said, speech, occupational, physical therapy, post stroke or post autism diagnosis or anything like that, there's just a huge gap there. And there's a huge opportunity to create savings in terms of stopping rehospitalizations, but also maybe continuing care so that patients don't necessarily have to go back, or that they can reach an even higher potential of betterment.
So in terms of your go-to-market or your customer acquisition strategy, right? So you have multiple different segments. You have the school districts, you have the healthcare facilities, and now potentially you have the enterprise market, large healthcare systems and things like that. So how have you thought about acquiring customers in each of these segments, and how is that strategy evolving over time?
So initially, it was anyone that I could get to pay attention. Healthcare and education and everything in between, which is a lot of different types of institutions. And now it's really a focused effort on healthcare and that enterprise level, or those larger rehabilitation institutions. How did we get there? It was essentially just analyzing the market and really understanding what those market needs are, but what are those market needs at those different types of levels, and what product components do we need that would be most applicable to the most amount of people in the shortest period of time. So it's a little bit of like a frequency severity, right? How frequently would we need to change things, but how much impact would we make? And for me, it was so much more about, I want to make as big of an impact as possible, and then be able to adapt to get those smaller segments and everyone on board to move forward in terms of a larger scale.
I'm hearing that it's tending more towards you'll do whatever changes you need to do to make sure that you actually are maximizing. You're solving for impact, in other words, no matter what the effort is, provided it makes financial sense and it's going to continue to give positive returns to you and to any investors who are there today or may be there tomorrow. Is that?
Yeah, with a focused effort. So the difference is, as we're looking at these larger organizations, they tend to be focused on 3 to 4 different electronic medical records that are in those spaces. So that's only 3 or 4 electronic medical records that we need to integrate with and or use partnerships to integrate with. Comparatively speaking to if you step down into medium and smaller size organizations, the number of options for electronic medical records and documentation exponentially grows. There's a lot of different players in those markets. So that's a lot of different adaptation that would need to happen to reach more clinicians and patients to help them. So it's kind of a frequency severity in terms of it's pointed, meaning that we are really trying to touch points that are very laser focused at the specific electronic medical records within specific settings, for now outpatient. prove efficacy and outcome. And then we will start to expand the product to, one, serve more electronic medical records, but two, serve more patients at different stages. So right after you get out of surgery in acute, for example, or inpatient, to other settings, for example, like home health and beyond, schools, for example, in the future, education, so an entirely different industry. But right now, laser focused based on kind of the conglomerate of how you think about what would be the smartest and most efficient way to tackle the market.
And in terms of these EMR providers, is that just something that you can independently program for? I'm not a technician, but or a technical person, but program for, or do you need to have any kind of partnership or collaboration or cooperation from these guys? And does that provide or does that offer additional challenges or hoops that you have to jump through to make sure that you are actually able to enter into these large health systems?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is a great point and a great question. So the electronic medical records, yes, it's a pretty significant barrier to entry, right? Because they own the majority of our patient, not own, but they house the majority of our patient data. And in that way, being able to connect with them is obviously imperative. So for example, our 12 to 24 month runway and outlook on what we're looking to do is actually connect to these larger electronic medical records through a third party intermediary. What does that do? That allows us one connection point, but to reach these multiple electronic medical records by just having to connect to one API. The goal here is to prove efficacy and outcome. And once that's done, then we'll build directly into partnerships with those electronic medical records. There's probably other types of strategies and types of acquisitions or components that might make sense at that time.
That's it's just fascinating once you get all these large players and trying to get to your market. So thanks for walking through that. One other question on your business model, and we'll move on to funding. Is there any IP involved in your, because you came up with this method from scratch and clearly technology is facilitating that, but there's a thinking behind it and a logic in terms of how you translate that note into a visual representation. What are your thoughts on how much IP there is and to what extent has that figured into your business model? Have you done anything to protect it?
That's a great question. So there's a proprietary algorithm, which I know is just such a buzzword, but it's actually true here. So what's actually happening on the back end of SmartCharts is we're really evaluating different components that go into writing a goal. And a goal, for example, has 5 to 7 different components in terms of increasing your ability, your skill, and decreasing the supports that you need. And we're basically matching information based on different types of levels of change. And by doing that, we're creating a database that allows us to figure out through AI and machine learning what would be specific factors that will impact different individuals. So, for example, I had 4 knee surgeries when I was 16 versus if I had 4 knee surgeries at 50, 60 years old. What would my expectations be and what could I expect to see in terms of that betterment process? It's not linear. We're never getting better if you're never able to just start running 10 days after a knee surgery, but having the idea that taking the kind of the black box, right? When you get hurt, it's like, what does this mean to me? How long is this going to be? And really turning that into expectations based on norms that are really centered around us as individual people and characteristics is what we're working to do. So there's the IP there on the back end that is the kind of this evaluated and intricate system that creates data to do the AI. In terms of protecting that IP, right now we're just using it as a trade secret. And, I've had numerous conversations in terms of what to do with those components. And there's a little bit of that being driven by investors too, in terms of trying to understand where does this fit and what can we protect and what we can't. So that's an ongoing process, as I feel like the entire startup process is. So much learning and so much to figure out along the way. But at the moment, it's just a trade secret and it's internal to our employees.
We talked about investors and this ongoing process. When did you first start getting an understanding of the funding landscape? How did you get up to speed in terms of different sources of capital? And what were your biggest learnings and takeaways as you moved through that process that helped you get off to a funding start?
Yeah. Wow. This is such a loaded question. uh, this is, I would say that the funding journey is probably not unique to me. If you've never been in the startup community before. So there was just a ton to learn about and from people within the community. What does that mean? That accelerator, that first accelerator through Matter Chicago and YWCA was so huge. It allowed me to create a community of other founders and entrepreneurs that were in the health tech space and med tech space, which is, every solution kind of has its own hurdles and its own barriers. And so it was really great to have a community to go to ask those questions and also just be honest about what you did and didn't know. So there's one or two that I particularly really relied on that I'd met through that process who kind of introduced me to that landscape. And then from there, it was a ton of research about figuring out what is this? What do I actually need? How do you build an appropriate financial model? Every model should be very specific to the business. Different components like that just take time and a lot of research, as well as a lot of humility. I would say being able to ask those questions and putting your fear aside of, I may not sound like I know what I'm talking about. Well, frankly, you don't. If you're asking some of these questions, right? Or if you don't know what you're talking about, just admitting it and kind of leaning into it to try to figure out exactly what will arm you in those conversations with those funders. And then figuring out those resources. I don't know anything exists out there right now. Quite frankly, there's a lot of different tools and there's a lot of different like websites that you can go to, but that gives you kind of a larger scale perspective on who you should be matching with and what you should be doing. There's a lot of different types of programs based on geographic location and kind of the solution type, but it was just really, again, a lot of research and a lot of networking. And I think it's really important to really lean into those second and third contexts and ask those questions specifically when it comes to those introductions to make sure that you're talking to the right people and that also your interests are aligned.
Any learnings that came from that would have made it more efficient for you now looking back in terms of that learning?
I would love to say yes, but honestly, I think that the funding process is extremely, extremely difficult if you haven't been through it before. I would say getting involved, what has helped is other founders that are not first-time founders being able to walk you through their experiences. So hopefully you can talk to me in 5 or 10 years when I'm on the second or third company and it's a little bit different. But the idea that they've been through it and that as you've gone through it as a founder once before, I've heard that you have a little bit lay of the land, you've got more context and it helps a little bit more in terms of understanding. I think that anybody with experience going through fundraising is helpful to any new founder just starting the journey.
Excellent. And one last question on funding, and then I want to talk about your personal experience through this. You talked a lot about financial models and how central the whole model is and projections are to everything, really, to your strategy, frankly, and also obviously to fundraising. You already have experience building amazing Excel spreadsheets, I'm sure. What were your learnings and big takeaways in terms of the financial modeling that you think entrepreneurs should keep in mind?
Well, one component is that, how do I describe this? That every business should have its own financial models, and being able to understand your own model and articulate your own model has been invaluable to me as a founder. And I think that it really allows you to be a lot more confident in terms of all of those components that we've touched on already. So what does that mean? Projections. That means go to market strategy. That means customer acquisition costs, as well as what you're going to be charging for your product and what those projections are into the long term for what you'll need in each round. I know that seems like a lot for a non-Excel founder. So there's just tons of resources out there. And there are also additionally a lot of different programs that they can use to get started at least, but being able to tweak those models and really understand how your business is different, what little tiny factors might be nuances that you should actually add or detract from the models that you're building or starting from is really important. I think that makes a founder stand out when they're talking to potential investors, but also with the idea of creating a model that works with you as you're continuing to grow. If you don't know how it works, you can't continue to update the information real time to help you figure out what those next steps are or potential red flags around the corner.
There's a perception among some women that they're afraid of numbers or I don't want to deal with the math. What counsel would you give them to say, here's the bare minimum and here's how to be able to wrap your head around it in your user-friendly terms, whatever they might be, even if you're not an Excel nerd?
Yeah. Well, I challenge that, women being afraid of math. I think I've always gravitated towards numbers. I like the idea of being able to play with them and knowing if you're right or wrong. And it's a safe space. So knowing that, hey, if you want to go and play in an Excel sheet and figure, there's a ton of resources on Instagram and Reels and whatnot that are just short little clips of figuring out shortcuts and things like that, which seem really silly, but I continue to still watch those things to learn little tips and tricks. But secondarily, again, leaning on your community. Who are those? In my group of friends, I'm that nerdy Excel friend and I just lean into it. And they all know that I would be more than happy, as well as my entrepreneur circles now and anybody that would need help in terms of figuring out what feels like very overwhelming stuff, is something I'm really willing to do. And I know that there's a ton of Excel nerds out there and data nerds just like me. So I would say leaning into other people, but asking those questions, having the humility, and also taking the idea that we can't do something out of our vocabulary. So yes, you can do a financial model. It is possible. It's going to take time, but it's the same thing. It's the same process as anything else, right? I've had to really be humble and learn a lot of hard lessons along the way that feel really heavy and really difficult to start. But looking back, if I had not had some of those moments of, oh man, what am I going to do where I don't know what to do? Who do I go to? And then find the right person. It's just being determined to find the right person and to find the right resources.
And has there been one example of a heavy lesson that you just mentioned that you care to talk about?
A heavy lesson. Ooh, there's just so many heavy lessons. So it's just so funny. I laugh because during the pandemic, and I don't want to keep going back to this, but it was such an unfortunate time for me to be launching a education and or healthcare application at that time, which even based on this conversation has evolved into a straight healthcare solution at enterprise level only, right? That took 18 months or even longer for me to come to those solutions and or come to that conclusion and come to that level of specificity and continuing to refine what that means now. I think the hard lessons for me there were I dug in. I really, really thought this was going to be an education solution, and being able to think dynamically about what that solution means, even if it wasn't in the space that I wanted it right away, was something that I fought for a long time and went down a path that look where I am now. Education is in the future. We'll get there. Teachers can definitely use it. And special education, it's set up for that. But at the current moment, I think looking back and the COO slash or CTO of the development firm would laugh at me for this, but we've got just kind of an inside saying of like, now think really hard. Are you really stuck on this? Because it's always one of these jokes that I stuck on it for way too long and maybe brought us down a path that it was a mental sticky note versus actually looking at what the data was telling us that, hey, there's tons of other clinicians in these other spaces that are looking at your solution organically. So that was a hard lesson. That was a hard pivot for me. And now it's just like, how do I help as many people as possible and get this out there to help as many people as possible, as refined and focused and as profitably as possible to make sure that we can make it to those next stages.
And I just love the example you gave because it is the heart of the conflict between what keeps you going as an entrepreneur is this ability to see that 11-year-old kid and be able to impact one life. And that's where your heart, I'm hearing, was pulling you. And then having to switch to the more rational, let's look at the numbers, let's see what makes sense, right? That's a tough one for any entrepreneur. Was there anything that helped you make that transition that made it easier? Was there any flipping point and any inflection point, anything that other founders could maybe benefit from?
Absolutely. So, with all honesty, it was fear. And so, when I went back to what did I build this business for? Why did I start this? Right. And I don't know that I have this clear mission now. Talk to me today, see me on the street here in Chicago. I can tell you exactly who I want to help and why I want to help them and why I'm going to make a difference and where this is going to go and why we'll be the next big conglomerate it's taking over a new level of data that most people aren't looking at. Anyways, I digress. It was fear. It was fear of not being able to help people with my ultimate goal. So the idea that there's so many people out there struggling. For me, it was after my knee surgery and not understanding what was actually happening in the process. So I was depressed and I was frustrated and I could never see myself playing soccer again. And I went back to that person, that 16-year-old little girl that had to quit, after the fourth knee surgery and reimagining who I was at that point because too many knee surgeries and I just didn't have the ability or the fight to turn around and keep going. And quite frankly, I just physically couldn't do it anymore. And so the idea of how do I help that little girl and then my mother? There's an even earlier story that as I think back on my journey, has really driven me throughout. I really believe I was built to do this. And so the idea behind that is that fear that I couldn't help patients in general at the worst times of their lives. My mom actually had a stroke when I was 3 years old, and she had to learn how to walk, talk, read, and write. And she had a journey that was long and definitely difficult, frustrating, and very confusing. So my mom and I grew up together as she was recovering. And I noticed all of these types of struggles that she was going through while she was going through speech therapy as well as physical therapy. She ultimately never finished her full course of therapies, which only 1 in 10 patients do now. And as I grew up to think through how this has all come together, I was really on a mission to make sure that nobody else had to go through what I went through personally, what she went through personally. And I do believe the reason she didn't finish is because she couldn't see the incremental change at the end. And those small differences now today still impact her in terms of having a drop foot, in terms of some slips and falls now in her mid and late 70s. And the sad thing about that is nothing has changed in over 30 years. And that can't continue to happen. And so the fear of not being able to help patients like that 11-year-old or the 4-year-old that I saw with autism come up with her first functional sentences, or that 80-year-old with his first, meaningful request with words, being able to see those changes and that impact, that it didn't matter to me which patients I was starting with as long as I could start somewhere. So in terms of when I think back to what was it, it was fear that I would never get this solution out there and that I would never be able to help people that like myself, like my mother, and like those amazing patients that I was able to work with.
I love it. Totally makes sense. And I think something that I personally can relate to as a founder myself. And I'm pretty sure being able to dig into your past and digging into your motivation to make sure that they meet what the market needs is, I just love it. Thank you for sharing that. One question on the product, as you were talking through these applications in areas beyond speech therapy, are you seeing the ability to expand the utility of what you've created to other domains? Or how much of a stretch is that to take it outside of speech?
So right now, actually, it's a functional product in 3 different domains, or what we call disciplines. So speech, occupational therapy, and physical therapy. And we have a little bit of functionality in audiology as well right now. The focus in terms of being very, very focused on making sure that we're delivering on that value proposition within rehabilitation settings. So this is for individuals that are post-diagnosis, for example, like my mom who had a stroke, or maybe it's a knee surgery or hip surgery, or things like that, to be able to see their incremental progress across all of their goals. So it's for those 3 disciplines currently and within the healthcare industry now, which we're hyper focused actually developing the product towards. That doesn't mean that in the future there isn't an opportunity, as we talked about where we started, in education. So industries that I see us moving into the future would definitely be the higher education and kind of research industries, but also you have a disability in a clinic setting as a little kid, you definitely have a disability at school as well. So being able to provide smart charts in those settings as well. And then furthermore, we're actually continuously working on adding gamification into smart charts right now to increase at-home practice and at-home therapy for speech, occupational physical therapy, and then beyond that, wearable technologies, being able to combine the information that we know, for example, in physical therapy, to start to inform even more in the smart charts realm and help the clinician make even more precise decisions in terms of plans of care going forward.
Excellent. I love it. So you talked a little bit about some of the challenges you've overcome in terms of making pivots and so forth. What have been some highlights, some beautiful moments that made you feel like this is totally worth it and this is why I'm doing all this hard work?
Yes, yes. So I hate to keep bringing it back to the Tech Rise competition, but it is such an honor to participate in. But secondarily, I do think any founders in the Midwest that are BIPOC and female should definitely look into applying. It's just such a great resource for not only a platform but also information, as we talked about earlier, for first time or early entrepreneurs. But through that competition, my mother actually came to that competition, and that was the first time that she ever got to see me pitch. And my mom in my larger pitch is a big part of the story. And I actually really reframed it for that competition itself, and now continue to reframe how I introduce her into kind of the purpose behind Smart Charts. And it was just such a special moment for her to be there while I was not only pitching, but also just for the culmination of everything that I've been working on for so long. She's seen the struggles and not understood the long hours or over Thanksgiving break working on those some of those slides. And she got it. And I feel like the audience got it. And so I finally feel like I got my messaging right that night, and people really understood the impact of what this could have, not just for clinicians and just the patients that I spoke about, but one thing I always say about SMARTCharts is that it touches every single one of our lives. I don't know in a room that I've ever spoken to that if I were to ask, do you know anybody that's been in speech, occupational, and or physical therapy, that there isn't one person that raises their hands? Because it's everything from multiple sclerosis to cancer to COVID long hauler to developmental differences and diagnoses. So to see that she could actually grasp what I was doing and why I was doing it and how central she was, whether her or I knew it way back when until even now, was really, really huge. It was definitely one of those moments that you are seeing yourself from out of body and like, this is supposed to happen. So that's the number one. I still get goosebumps talking about it, but yeah, it was a really great shared experience because she was finally able to see what I was doing, why I'm doing it, and see where I am now with everything, which is so funny because that's how I describe SMARTCharts. It helps patients see what people are working on, why they're working on it, and where they are in their process. So it kind of comes full circle.
It's fantastic. I got goosebumps while you were telling me the story. So looking back, it's been a long journey, eventful one. Is there anything you do differently starting over?
Oh, what a great question. Funny enough, I was listening to a podcast earlier today, and I don't think that without going through all of the experiences that we've gone through, and I was about to say had to go through, but had the privilege of going through, but also had to kind of endure experience, make us who we are. And it, for me, has allowed me to come and bring myself full self to the table even more. I think I definitely, as a lot of entrepreneurs did and do, struggle with confidence at certain points in time. And like I said, learning what that model meant and learning how to describe that model and learning what this is and how to describe it to other people, and not my clinical terms and not my actuary terms, but in like real world terms. I think I've had to go through a lot of difficult moments and a lot of self-reflection moments and a lot of developmental moments. And I'm so thankful for mentors and my network who have just been real with me, but also so supportive of like, this is hard. This is real life type of stuff, meaning like entrepreneur stuff isn't for everybody. And that's such a cliche, but had I known what I was going to go through, I'm not sure I would still be here. But now that I'm here, I'm like, somebody, I try to take it away from me because I am like, I'm a fighter for this, and I really believe in what I'm doing, and I really know what I'm doing is the right path for me and the right path for healthcare right now. So
Fantastic. And if there's one, just to conclude, there's one non-obvious tip or hack that you would offer to other entrepreneurs maybe earlier in that journey that you're on, what would that be?
find your personal mantra. I would say find, when you were talking about that moment in time or that moment of what kind of gives you goosebumps or what's such a great moment, there, for me, I'm all weirdly enough, as a speech pathologist now, all about words. And there have been different phrases or sentences or words of encouragement that mentors or my network have given to me. And I write them down. And then I use that. I use that until it's exhausted, until the next one sticks out to me. So I'm constantly repeating to myself different types of mantras that are given to me, not that I've devised. And I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but it's definitely, when I hear it from other people and then repeat it to myself, it's just becoming that much more real and that much more, I don't know how to describe it, but it just allows me to bring the full business and the full self to the table.
And what's one that you're working on now, or one that has really worked for you in the past?
I may have said it during this interview. I was meant to do this. That was given to me from another member within the Techstars community when I was going through that cohort. So that's the one I'm working with. It's been about 5-6 weeks, so we'll see what comes next.
That works for me. So thank you very much, Corinne. This has been an amazing conversation and a moving one. So I know for one that I'll be rooting for you, and I'm pretty sure many more will be. So all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, that was a hard conversation to finish up within the time we had. Corinne is smart, empathetic, and self-aware, and it was a conversation that was packed with insights. Here are my top 10. 1. It takes an alert and open mind to recognize, honor, and act on small motivations and actually make them work. Do you have one of these tugging away at you? 2. You truly can start where you are, do what you can with what you have, while staying alert to entrepreneurial opportunities. 3. These opportunities often show up as annoying problems in your daily life and work. 4. If you've been sitting on an idea for a while, it doesn't mean the right time for it has passed. You can start evaluating it afresh today. 5. There may be a lot of access and resources hidden away in your current network, but in a context that's different from entrepreneurship. Can you take a look at your entire context and see it with new eyes? 6. The basic blocking and tackling aspects of building a business cannot be skipped over. You have to learn the hard parts, even if they're alien to your nature. 7. That unexpected and big things will happen is a given. The real question is, what can you lean into to turn the tide in your favor? 8. Recognize when it's time to let go of cherished assumptions, still stay inspired. 9. There are some businesses you can't build without outside money. Recognize it early and get ahead of the task. Last but not least, you must constantly be assessing, revisiting, and rebalancing where you are, where you want to go, and how you'll get there. There are no shortcuts. So, what's one thing you can take away and improve with your goal, your path, or your motivation? Thanks for listening to today's episode. We have show notes and more at achieve.co. That's achieve.co/podcast. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe and share with a friend. See you on the next episode. Now, go be an achiever.